Dear Pregnancy Counseling Center staff, thanks so much for joining us for this training about stigmas surrounding adoption. I'm Daniel Nerbass, the president of Nightlight Christian Adoptions, and I'd like to share with you some research that was done by the National Council for Adoption about stigmas relating to adoption. So there have been four major stigmas in the history of adoption in the United States, all within the last century. The first is the stigma of being adopted. Back in the 50s and 60s, if a child was adopted, people would whisper, "Shh, she's adopted." So there was the stigma that being adopted was a lesser status in life and something unfortunate for a child to endure. I think we can all agree that that has largely disappeared. We really don't see the presence of a stigma for being adopted anymore. It's become a very normalized part of our culture, with all the children adopted from abroad and from foster care, as well as infants. That stigma, fortunately, has disappeared. There also was a stigma back in the 50s and 60s, persisting through the 70s, of adopting. It was associated with infertility. Infertility was associated with shame. And so people would say things like they had to adopt. They had to look at adoption. And of course, nowadays we would never say something like that. You get to adopt. You have the blessing of adoption. So there's really no stigma nowadays of being an adoptive parent. Now, of course, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was a stigma of being a single parent. And this was what led to the pre-Roe versus Wade situation in this country of infants being in children's homes where we needed to find families for all of these infants. And it led to the beginning of our particular adoption agency. Our agency was founded in the late 50s, called the Evangelical Welfare Agency, and we were commissioned by our denomination, the National Association of Evangelicals, to find Christian families for all these babies. Well, why were there all these babies? It's because women were put away. If they were pregnant and they were single, especially if they were young, they were sent away to a maternity home to give birth and then return back to their community without their baby, and then that baby would be placed with a couple. That also is a relic of the past, and the decisions since Roe versus Wade completely changed the number of babies who were being placed for adoption. It's estimated that before Roe versus Wade, 8% of pregnancies were resulting in adoption, and after Roe versus Wade, less than 1% of pregnancies would result in adoption. So part of it is abortion that has reduced the number of babies who are being adopted, but a large change in the number of babies being placed for adoption is not just accounted by abortion. It's accounted for by the change in the stigma of being a single parent. Now, lastly, there's an enduring stigma, which is the stigma of placing for adoption. And that's why we're doing this training today. This is where you can help, and this is where we really need to look at our situation today of what is causing more abortions and fewer adoptive placements, and it is a stigma. The thinking goes like this, and you've probably heard it. I could never place a child for adoption. I could just never do that to them. To which many of us would say, so you would rather have the child die than you would have an easier time with that than placing the child for adoption? And the cold hard truth from some people is yes, they would rather have the child die than place the child for adoption. Where is this bizarre thinking coming from? It is partly influenced by a terrible stigma in our culture today of placing for adoption. Because it's not just the women facing the unplanned pregnancy who are saying, I could never place for adoption. It's their community saying it to them. It's their teachers, their parents, their friends, and the medical community, the nurses and doctors. And this is how it comes out. They say, how could you make a decision like that? I don't think I'd ever be able to make a decision like that. Once we say to the woman in crisis pregnancy, oh, I could never do that. Well, she's going to hear, maybe I shouldn't be doing that either. So the stigma of placing for adoption, what we hear, especially in the medical community, is you don't need to do this. You can you don't need to place this baby for adoption. You can choose something else, uh, whatever that something else is. So it might be parenting, but it might be abortion. And let me just give you some evidence behind what I'm saying here. So the National Council for Adoption actually did some research in 2023. It was called the Birth Parent Satisfaction Survey, and they looked at the sources of stigma. Now get this, 34% of birth mothers reported that their parents stigmatized them for them making a decision to place their baby for adoption. 36% of birth mothers said that they felt stigmatized by their other relatives. Well, nearly 34% of birth moms said that they felt a stigma for placing for adoption coming from their friends. But get this, 31.7% of the birth moms who were surveyed said they felt stigmatized by their nurse or their healthcare worker. Now we can see this firsthand in our work because we get called to the hospitals by women who say they want a place and they're there in the hospital, they just gave birth, and we watch time after time these adoptive placements unravel from women who have thought about adoption for 9 months since the moment they found out they were pregnant, because the nurse in the hospital tells them that they shouldn't place for adoption. So they show up in the hospital and the nurse unravels what we've just been working on with them, or they've been working on with a pregnancy counselor for months, maybe for 9 months. So the stigma is very powerful in causing women to make a poor decision at the last minute from something that they may have given a lot of thought to. Now there's some other findings about birth mother satisfaction, which is what was the mother concerned about? And you can take this to heart as you're speaking to women facing crisis pregnancy. The women who placed their children for adoption said, what were they worried about at the time? They were worried they would miss their child, that they wouldn't know what happened in their child's life, that their child would be angry with them, that they would be disappointing their family and friends, and disappointing the child's other birth parent, or that the adoption might cut off the relationship. Now here's something really important for all of us to be aware of. All of these concerns can be mitigated through open adoption. And we're going to see from the research that this is what happened. Those concerns were allayed and were resolved through the growth and the growing prevalence of open adoption. So if you think of adoption in the 60s and 70s, these were closed adoptions where the birth mom wouldn't know who adopted their child. They wouldn't know how the child is doing, and they would never speak to the child again. Well, of course they're going to have these concerns. But since the 80s and 90s, open adoption has become the standard. In fact, for our agency and nearly every other reputable agency like ours, it's the only option that we offer our adoptive families because it's the only thing the birth parents are looking for. So open adoption is the expectation and the norm. And then women don't need to worry so much about whether they're going to know what happened in the child's life. They will know what happened in the child's life. They're going to see that child grow up and they're going to get communication with the child. They don't need to worry whether the child is disappointed with them. They're going to be able to speak to the child. So total different landscape that open adoption has created to allay the fears or concerns that birth parents expressed. Now, birth mothers were asked, is it a blessing or is it a positive outcome for everyone involved? And the vast majority of birth mothers agree that adoption is in the best interest for the child, the best interest of the adoptive parents, and the best interest of the birth parents. And so we have an expression at our agency, adoption blesses everyone. I hope it's true. I believe it's true. And I think this research shows that even the birth parents believe it to be true. Now, I said there was some research that showed that birth mothers are happier with their decisions nowadays. And I think that's clear from the research here. There's a statistically significant growth or standard deviation in the change of the average ranking that women reported for how satisfied they are with their decision to place for adoption. So it's a 5-point scale, and a 2.5 right in the middle of a 5-point scale, would mean that the birth mothers were neutral about their decision to place for adoption. So even for those in the 1970s, more than half of the women were satisfied with their decision to place. But on that 5-point scale, by 2010, the score reached 3.9. That's almost a 4 out of 5, meaning that almost 80% of birth moms were satisfied with their decision to place for adoption. So the number of women satisfied with their decision to place for adoption is rapidly and significantly growing with time. Why? Because open adoption is growing with time. The reason they're more satisfied is that adoptions have become more open. Now, we'll just end with this. What can you do? You can help us eliminate the stigma of placing for adoption. You can understand the fears and concerns that women have when placing for adoption, and you can encourage women with hope that many women are satisfied with their decision to place for adoption, and the reason they're satisfied is that their fears were resolved through open adoption. Thank you for your great work that you do.